In today's lesson, we're going to be building a full PHP register and login system. We're going to have the capability for a user to register an account. We're going to be storing that account inside of a database. MySQL or MySQL is what we'll be using. We're going to be talking about sessions and then also able to log into the session with user authentication and password hashing as well. There'll be a lot of little gotchas and tips and tricks along the way. So follow along and let's get started. This is what the final product is going to be looking like. We're going to build almost all of this from scratch. The only exception is I will link down in the description the starting files. We're not going to be doing the HTML and CSS. In other words, the design of the little form elements. We're simply going to be using some very basic boilerplate forms here that uses Bootstrap CSS file on the back end. So you can go ahead and download the starting file so you can start from the exact same position that I'm at right here. Now, a couple of quick prerequisites in order to accomplish this project. Because we are working with PHP, you will need to have a local development server installed. I recommend that you start with MAMP or WAMP, W-A-M-P or M-A-M-P. Those will get you set up with PHP, an Apache server, and a MySQL database, which are all of the requirements that you have to have set up and configured in order to begin this project. So we're going to be starting at the point that assumes you've already got a development server running. We're going to be running right into the PHP code and getting started. Now, just a couple of topics we'll be covering: sessions, PHP authentication, and password hashing, as well as inserting and removing data from a database using PHP's PDO. And so there's going to be a lot in this tutorial. And in typical fashion, I will be explaining every step along the way, not just throwing tons and tons of code at you, but I will be explaining the fundamentals so that you understand these concepts and be able to repurpose them for your own projects. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. Now, the initial page here is what we're going to be calling the login form. So I can fill in some data here, and then if I go ahead and say login, it's going to either log me in if my credentials are correct, or it's going to kick me back out if my credentials are incorrect. We also have a register page here. So behind the register page, I can go ahead and create a user account. We're going to have some built-in error messages as well inside of these pages so that if the user doesn't fill in the proper data, we'll throw back some messages and say, hey, your password's required. So here it's going to say I've got to provide an email address. So I can provide that and then register and a few things like that. So we're going to have a lot of those built-in functionality that we'll be adding along the way. So this is what it looks like. We have a register page, we have a login page, and then when we log in, it'll present us with a private page, which is our welcome email that only authenticated users can access. So again, this is the starting point. There's no PHP yet inside of these pages. So let's show you the file structure here to start out, and then we're going to jump right into it. So I'm going to move this screen over here, and we'll get going. So I've got my screen now here set up, and I'm going to go through the required files. There's only 5 PHP files that we're going to be working with. Okay, the first one here is called connection.php. This is where we're going to house our configuration, our username and password that allows us to authenticate and connect with the database, and a few things like that. Our index.php is going to be serving as our login file. So this is the landing page essentially. It basically just has a really simple form here with a couple of elements. We have an input field for the email, we have an input field for the password, and then we have a submit button. So that's really all there is to that page. This is the one we're seeing right over here on the right. We also have a register page. So this is the page where a user can create a new account. It's very similar to the login page. The only real difference is that we also have the addition here of a name. So we're going to capture a user name or something like that. Now this page, of course, is where you would yourself capture any additional information you want, gender, birth date, all that sort of things that you want to capture from your users, you would place inside of this page here. All we're capturing is name, email, and password. And then we have this welcome page here. This is the page that's essentially going to be behind the authentication. So users cannot access the welcome page unless they are authenticated. So it's just going to really be a blank page, and we'll maybe have some welcome message that says welcome to the site or something like that. And then lastly here, we have the logout page. So if the user wants to log out of your system, they can click the logout button, and we'll write some logic in here that will destroy their session and then redirect them back to the login page. Okay, so that's it. That's the 5 pages that we're going to be using. We're going to start out today inside of the connection.php page where we'll be adding and working with our database. All right, now the first thing we're going to do is open up a PHP tag. So we'll go ahead and open that up, and we're going to create a couple of local variables here. So we're going to say db, whoops, $ here, db, this is going to just stand for database. We need to know the host. So right now I'll just leave that as a blank string. We also need to know I'm going to say db underscore, the username. So this is the username of our database that gives us permission to log in there. And then we also have to have a password. So we're going to say db, whoops, pass for password. I guess I'll type that all the way out to make it a little bit easier for you guys to read those variable names. And then the last thing we need to know is the actual name of the database. So we're going to say db underscore name. So we'll set that up sort of like that. Okay. Now, of course, you're going to have to fill this out with your own host, username, password, and things like that. So within your map or wherever you have your server set up, you're going to have to go into your MySQL settings, create a table, and then look and see what the connection and configuration settings are for you. All right, then we're going to add in the connection attempt. So we're going to write some code to connect our PHP to the database. So we're going to write this inside of a try catch. So we're going to create a new variable here. It's going to be called database, and we're going to use a thing called PDO. So sometimes you'll see tutorials on the internet that'll use just raw SQL queries on a database. That's kind of an outdated method, and it opens yourself up to what are known as SQL vulnerabilities. So people can potentially hijack or even delete your database if you don't properly escape MySQL strings. So the PDO library in PHP makes a lot of those security issues go away because it has named attributes and placeholders and things like that, so that folks can't write raw SQL queries as parameter strings inside of your forms and hijack your database. So I highly recommend you use PDO when you're accessing the database. It does add a little bit more complexity, but it's not all that difficult, and it's well worth it. Okay, so the PDO you can see here has several parameters for this little function here. It has the DSN, it has a username, it has the password, and then a bunch of options over here. Okay, so we're going to be using the driver of MySQL in my instance. So I'm going to say MySQL. You could use MySQL Lite or something like that as well, or MySQL. So the first parameter here is going to be host. So the host is going to be set to whatever your database host is. In that case, that's our variable we declared earlier. So db underscore host. And then we're going to add a database name. So db name, that's going to equal our variable we created up there. So that's going to be our db name. And then that's all we need for that first parameter. Okay, so we'll comma. You can see the second parameter here is the actual username. So that's going to be our user over here. We can just copy that variable and drop it in right there. Another comma, and then we have our password. So we'll copy this password and drop it in right here. And that is all we need for that line. So that basically creates a connection, an active connection to your database. And then we can start to write SQL statements to pull and fetch and insert data. So the next little thing here we're going to do is just set up a couple of attributes on our database. So we're going to say set attribute. This is a method here. And we're just going to say PDO. This is going to turn on some of the error. This is the error modes, ATTR, error mode. And then one more, PDO. We're also going to do the error mode exceptions. Okay. So this will help us be able to troubleshoot exceptions and problems like that if we encounter them. All right, next thing we're going to do is finish off our try here with a catch. So we have to do our catch the errors. Whoops, I have caps lock turned on. So we're going to catch our errors. This is going to be a PDO exception. Spelled that wrong. EXC exception, like that. That's correct. Okay, so it's going to be, whoops, caps lock on again. And we're just going to echo out. So if we have any connection errors, we just want to immediately display them on our screen so that we can see any problems we might be encountering when trying to connect. And so we'll just say get message. So this will get any error messages we have if the try fails and display those on our screen. So we can go ahead and save there. If I come over here and let's go ahead and make sure we're on our index page. Okay, that looks fine. So now, of course, we need to fill in these credentials with your own credentials. So I'm going to come over here to my index page, and we will include this connection file. Essentially, any page on our website that needs access to the database, we have to include that connection parameter. So we're just going to come up here to line 1 on our index.php, and we need to write some code to include that. So we're just going to do the require once statement inside of PHP. This will just require this file a single time. We're just going to say connection.php. Whoops, I forgot to open up my PHP tags. So I'm going to open the PHP and close the PHP tags. Just as a little tip, if you're writing PHP inside of HTML, you need to have the opening and closing tags. In the connection file, whoops, over here, because this is always just pure PHP, you can omit the closing PHP tag. You don't have to have the closing one in this instance. So that's why I did not add it there. Okay, now we've required the connection.php in our index. So if I come over here and refresh my index page, it's going to start giving me any errors. And sure enough, I've already got an error. It says I've got an error on connection line 10. So let's go over here to connection. Let's look at line 10 and see what error we could possibly be having. And set attribute. Oh, whoops, I have 2 semicolons right there. You guys probably noticed that already. Let's see if that fixes that. Let's go ahead and refresh. Nope, that was one of the errors. But we still have an error. Oh, whoops, I need 2 semicolons. That's actually a method. I was missing one on this one. So there we go. I needed 2 right there, and I needed 2 right there. So that's a static call there. There we go. So this is what I was expecting to happen. Now you can see I've got myself an error. It says access denied for user blank. So this is coming from this catch statement right here because it's trying to connect to the database and I'm getting an error because I don't have any credentials here. So go ahead and fill in your database with the credentials you need. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. So my database is on localhost, my username, follow Andrew. I cannot remember my password, so I'm going to have to go look this up. And my database name, I know I've already created that. Mine's just called users. So I created a database called users for this sample. I'll look at my password here and then we'll jump right back. Okay, so I filled in all those credentials and I refresh over here on my index and you can see the connection error goes away. That's a good sign. That means I'm successfully connected to my database. Next step is we're going to jump over and actually make sure we have that database set up with our correct table. So let's move over. Now you can use a few different programs here. If you're on a Mac, the program I recommend that I really like is called SQL Ace. It's this one right here, SEQUEL Ace. So you can use SQL Ace. If you're on a Windows machine, you can use Table or Table Plus. I think they have a free version, or you can simply use the PHP version, which is called phpMyAdmin, and just use the web interface to access your database as well. I think that actually may be bundled with the default map. I'm not sure on that. But phpMyAdmin is a web interface to access your database as well. I just prefer these little dedicated apps myself for working with the database. So here I am currently looking at my database is actually called Login App. I told you it was users, but I actually called it Login App. So I've got a database here. There are no tables, so it's completely blank. So the first thing we need to do is create a table. So I'm going to come over here and click the plus button down here in my area that creates a table. If you're in phpMyAdmin, you have to look and see where the create table command is. And I'm just going to call this my users. So this is going to be a table that houses all of the user login credentials for my application. So we'll call that users. And by default in my SQL Ace, it automatically creates one field for you. So I've already got one set up called ID. And that's great. I want to have a default field called ID. Its type is set to integers. I'm going to leave it length at 11, unsigned. Everything is default here. I want the key to be primary. So this is the primary key for this database. And I also want this special thing configured, which is the auto increment. Auto incrementing on this row. What that means is every single new row that gets added to the database, the ID field will automatically go up by 1. So it'll start at 1, then the next user will be 2, the next one will be 3, 4, 5. So that ID row will always be unique per user. Now I'm going to be using the ID to also identify my users, but if you wanted to have, if you didn't want those IDs to be public or accessible, you could always use a UUID field, which is a really long string of characters that's not identifiable. So there's, again, I'm not going to get into the plus and minuses of that, but I'm going to keep it simple with the ID. All right, so the next thing I need to capture is the name. So basically these fields are going to correspond to whatever your register field is. All the fields that you have on your register page, you need to have a spot to capture those in your database. So I want my user name. I'm just going to set that there. This is going to be a varchar, which is a variable character length. And I'm going to set this to, whoops. I'm going to let this be, I don't know, 50. Let's say I'm going to let my names be 50 characters long. And I'm not going to allow a null value, meaning this has to be a required field. And that's fine there. Next, I'll set up an email. And it's going to be the same thing if I can type that correctly. I know I'm going quickly over here, but I don't want to spend a ton of time on the database as that's not the primary objective of this. So variable character here, I'm going to set this one maybe to 100 just to allow slightly longer email addresses. We're not going to allow null. Next one is going to be the password. On the password field, I'm going to set this one to a char 60. So this is not going to be a variable. It's going to have to be exactly 60 characters long. And again, no null on this. And that's because when I capture the user's password, I'm actually going to be hashing that inside of PHP. So when I store the password in the database, you never want to store passwords in plain text. You always want to have like a hashed version and preferably salted version of the password as well. So mine are going to be 60 characters length after the hashing takes place. So that's why I'm going to set that up like so. And then lastly, I'm going to set up a field called created. And I'm going to set that to be a date time. And again, I'm not going to allow null. So all these are going to be required fields. The created is just going to allow me to know when the user created their account. So I can get an idea of, when users are signing up. Now, you can, of course, add many extra things to this. Maybe you want to have a field in here called user is active so that you can automatically deactivate or activate accounts based on permission. You may want to have a field in here called email is verified so that you know if a user's email address was actually verified when they signed up and you don't have, a bunch of spam users. Lots and lots of things like that that we're not going to cover in detail, but something you could definitely potentially add into your own project. And that's pretty much it. So we just have these 5 fields here inside of our database. And if you can see, I come over here to my content tab now, and you can see that there's no data. There are no users right now in my system, but at least I have the database structure set up. Okay, so that does it for the database. We'll come over here and peek again in a minute when we start registering our users to make sure they're populating correctly and our passwords are being hashed. But for right now, let's jump back to our code inside of VS Code. Okay, so we've got our connection, and let's go ahead and start to flesh out we're actually going to start with the register page, because it doesn't do any good to have a login form if we can't log in. We have to first be able to get users into the database. So we're going to jump over to register page, and I'll switch over here to the register page as well. Guess I have a link to it right there, but there we go. And I'm also zoomed out a hair bit here because we don't need to see. There's not a lot to see here right now. So again, let's just recap here. So we have a input field that is just a text. So they're going to put their name, they're going to put their email address. So this one has a type of email. Having the type of email is going to force the web browser, the HTML5 validation, so it won't allow something that's not an email. And then we have a password as well. And then we just have a button that's called register account. When they click this button, our form action right here is set to register.php. In other words, when they submit the form, it's submitting the form to itself. And we're going to add a bunch of logic up here to see if the form has been submitted. And if it has, check to see if the user exists in the database already, because if we already have a user with that email, we don't want to recreate an account for them. So we have to make sure we don't get duplicate data in the database and a few things like that. Now, I should also probably mention, this is worthwhile mentioning, a lot of database systems have the ability or feature to set data. So for example, I'm going to come in here and look at my email row. I can choose, enter here extra. Where's this one at? Oh, I have to add a key for it. Anyway, I can set up a key that's called a unique key. And if I do that, essentially the database is now going to enforce integrity and never allow the same email to be inserted into the database twice. We can also check for that within our own logic, which is what we're going to do. But it's a really good idea to have that redundancy to make sure you're never getting duplicate data in your database as well. We're not going to be doing that, but I wanted to mention that that's a very common thing that people will set up. Okay, back here to VS Code. and let's get started. So the first thing we're going to do is just like we did on our last screen, we have to require the connection. So we're going to say require once, and we need to require the connection.php file. Whoops, I need to open and close my PHP tags like I always forget to do. So we'll cut that and paste that back up there. Okay, now this next line is really the whole entire crux of this tutorial. It's called session start. So when I do the session underscore start command like this initiates a session inside of PHP for the current user on your page. And that session is valid and will be valid until the user closes the browser window. Now I can of course set up some timeouts and things like that in my code, but by default the session will begin, and then if the user closes the browser window, the session's destroyed automatically. Now what this does is whenever I create a session start, this allows me to then, this creates what's known as a super global inside of PHP, super global, which means I have access to a variable called $_ and then it's capital letters, it's this one right here, session. And I can access this variable anywhere in PHP. In other words, it has global scope. It doesn't matter if I'm inside of a function or outside of a function, it's accessible everywhere. So session start will allow me to start populating this global variable, which is an array, with data, any data I want. And when I store data in that session, it will persist across multiple page views inside of your browser window. That's what makes entire login systems possible, because HTTP by default is stateless. When you make a connection to a server, the connection's closed. So if you want to maintain, a connection with a user across multiple page views, you have to use something like cookies and sessions. That's the only way to do it. So let's go ahead and write some code here. All right. So the first thing we want to do is, if the user already has an authenticated session, if I'm already logged in, there's no point in being on the login page. So let's go ahead and redirect them to the welcome page. Okay. So we're going to say if, and then we're going to say is set, and then we're going to use that variable there, the session variable. So in other words, if the session variable is set and I have a user parameter, this is what we're going to define in a minute, then let's just go ahead and redirect them. So we're just going to use the header command here, and we're just going to say go to the location of welcome.php. So this basically is going to tell the browser to redirect them to the welcome page, which is the private page for authenticated users. Okay, so we'll just leave that there. And whoops. If I refresh now, you can see I'm not being redirected because I'm currently not logged in. So that's working properly. I always recommend when you're working with PHP, write a little bit of code and then refresh and test, because it's easier to catch your bugs if you just do that often. All right. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to check to see if this form has been posted. So in other words, if it's been filled out and the submit button has been pushed. Because if that happens, then I need to write a bunch of logic. So we're going to write one more if statement here. We're going to say if, again, is set. And in this case, we're going to be using the request variable. So it's right here called request. And we're going to be checking for login_button. Now the request is another super global inside of PHP. There's sort of 3 of these that work with forms. One of them is request, one of them is get, and one of them is post, and then we have files as well if there's uploaded files. So all of these 4 super globals in PHP have to do with when the user submits a form. Now we're submitting our method down here of our form in post. So method is set to post, which means we're not using get variables. Our data is going to be submitted behind the scenes, not visible in the URL. If we were to use get, then you would see all of the data right here in the URL. That's the difference between post and get. So this isn't a search engine, so we don't need to have get variables in this instance. Okay, so in other words, a request has both get and post variables. That's why we're going to use request for simplicity here. So if the login button is present in the request, now you can see down here in my form, I have a button, type equals submit, name is set to register button. Okay, so whoops, I typed that in wrong. We need to check for the register button, and that's the one we're after. Okay, Let's do this code now. So, just lost my train of thought. Okay, so if this will basically tell us if the form has been posted. So if the register button is present in the request, I know the user has actually clicked this button. So then I have to write some logic, okay? So now what we're gonna do is we're gonna grab all of the variables and convert them to local variables for simplicity's sake. So I'm gonna create a local variable called name, and that's going to be set to the request variable of name, okay? Simple as that. Now, all of these variables, right, the name attribute is the most important thing, right, in your HTML inputs, because the name attribute is what gets submitted. So when the user submits a form inside of PHP, these values right here get converted into associative arrays. So the name becomes the index of the associative array right here. Email will become another one, etc., etc. So I'm just going to set these up in local variables to make it easy. So we'll say name, this one's going to be email, and I'm going to set that to the request email. One more, password, because we only have the 3 fields over there. Password and password. As a tip, you never want to use spaces inside of your name attributes. That will break things. Always A through Z and underscores essentially is what we recommend there. All right, so I've set those up and that looks great. Now let's just do a little quick check to make sure our code is working right now. So what we're going to do is I'm going to do a command here, and I'm going to echo this to make this a little bit easier. I'm going to echo out a pre command. This is just an HTML tag. So the pre tag will do pre-formatted text, and then I'm going to do a command called print R. Print R stands for print recursive. In other words, it will output arrays. So I can do print recursive on the request variable, and this should output all of the data inside of the request variable and show it to me. So let's fill out this form. So I'm going to say name is follow Andrew, address is email@andrew.com, password 12345667. And let's go ahead and click register. And sure enough, you can see this code is executing, and there I get all of my data that the user typed in. So I've got all the values there, and it's working properly. Great. Now the next thing we need to start thinking about is security. So we don't want to just arbitrarily accept anything the user types in here and then start running SQL commands on that data. That's going to be problematic. So we're going to just look at a couple of simple things in PHP that'll help us sanitize that data. So this is data sanitization. And there's a couple of commands here that are fairly easy to use. This one's called filter underscore var for variable. So filter variable will sanitize this data. So for the name, I'm going to just use the one called filter. There's a bunch of flags in here. This one's filter underscore sanitize underscore string. There we go. So in other words, PHP is going to make sure that this variable is just a string. That's great, okay? So let's do another one down here for the email. We're gonna say filter variable, same thing as we did before, but this one is going to be filter sanitize, and this one will be email. So notice they have a built-in one for email, so we can go ahead and add that one. You can go ahead and look through some of the auto-filling here. There's all sorts of different things you can filter, but I'll just do email that way. This way, then make sure that our email address is in the proper format. So we'll add that one. And then on the password, this just depends on what your password requirements are. So if you're allowing uppercase and lowercase and dashes and hyphens and special characters and all sorts of things, you know, you'll have to filter that accordingly. In my case, I'll just do a really simple one called strip tags. So this will just make sure that there's no HTML sort of tags inside of this password field. So that looks fine there. Okay, so we are now sanitizing those bits of variables so that when we use them later in our SQL PDO, we know that the data should be fairly proper. Okay, next thing we need to do is set up some error checking. So we want to make sure that the user, in fact, fills out fields that are required, fields that may not be required. Maybe our password has to be a certain length, things like that. we need to check for and throw error messages back to the user if they don't format or fit into our requirements. So let's go ahead and do that next. We'll do one for each of these. So let's write an if statement. So we'll say if, I'm going to do empty here, if empty name. So in other words, if the name variable is empty or not present, we need to throw an error because we're going to require this. So I'll just set up a real simple variable here called error message, MSG. Okay, and I'm going to do this kind of in just a simple way here. It's just going to be an array, but I'm going to set this up as a, I can't talk and type at the same time, as an associative array, which with indexes. So I'm going to set this one to 0. Okay, all of the error messages that belong to the name field, I'm going to say are index 0 because I may have one or I may have multiple. Okay. And then all of the errors that belong to my email address, I'm going to use the index of 1. All of the errors that belong to the password, I'll use the index of 2. Okay, something like that to make it easy. So now I'm just going to basically copy this code. And before I copy it, let's make sure it works. So let's try to fill this form out. I'm going to come back here and get back to the default. I'll fill this out, but I'll leave the name blank. Actually, I have to give myself a message first. We'll do this step by step. Getting a little ahead of myself. So now that I have this check and I'm populating this error message, I'm going to come down inside of this right before the name field itself, and I'm going to check to see if the error message exists. And if it does, I'll output a message. Okay, so right down here, let's go ahead and say if, we'll do another if here. We're going to say if is set, and then we'll copy this error message 0. Okay, so in other words, if error message 0 exists, that means we do have error messages that we need to display. And then let's just loop through them. So we'll say for each error message 0 as, we'll just maybe call this email error or something, because these are the email errors. So we're looping through each of the possible indexes or array options in there. So let's copy down this, and then we'll just put out an error. So we're going to say echo, I'm going to do a paragraph here, and I'm going to say class equals small. This is bootstrap class. And then we'll say text-danger, which is going to be make the text turn red. And then we'll close the paragraph. And then inside of here, we'll just concatenate and drop in our email errors. Okay, so that should output a paragraph and then display the error right there. So now we can actually check it. So let's come in here and we'll fill out a password. Again, we're leaving the name blank on purpose. This right here isn't the name, that's a placeholder. That's coming from the placeholder field right there. So you can see as soon as I start to type, the placeholder goes away. So right now it's empty. Let's go ahead and click register an account. And sure enough, we get an error, except I have a problem. But we're getting name required. Let's see, what did I type here? Oh, whoops, I didn't, my little, see right there, my bracket, you can probably notice that, but I'm not supposed to close that bracket yet because it's closed right there. All right, let's go ahead and save and refresh that. Okay, perfect. So you can see, sure enough, I got an error. It came in red and said, sorry, I can't process your data because the name is required. As soon as I put the name in there and then register, that error goes away. So perfect, we have one of those set. Now we just need to repeat ourselves essentially 2 times for the other fields. So let's come up here and copy and paste. So let's, I'm gonna leave this pre-tag in here. I'm gonna delete this eventually. That's just for debugging, but I'll leave it there because it helps us visualize which data has been sent. So let's go ahead and copy this. We'll paste it down here. So this one we're gonna be checking for the, we have email. Let's check next for, or sorry, name. Now let's check for email. So we're just going to do the same thing here. We'll call this one email is required. And we got to set this one to index 1 because that's what I want for all of those guys. One more time, 2 more times. So in this one, we're going to be checking for password. And we'll set this to index 2. We're going to say password required. And then down here, we're going to check for something else. We're going to make sure that the password is a certain length. Okay. So we can say like str length. So if the string length, then we got to do our comparison in here, of password is less than 6 characters, okay, then we're gonna throw an error because we need to have more than 6. So we'll say must be at least 6 characters. Okay. So notice that for the password field, I have 2 messages. I have one that just makes sure it's required, and then I have another one that makes sure that we have at least 6 characters. And we'll just leave it at that. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 error messages there. Now we need to come down to our fields, and I'm going to copy and paste this code one more time. So above our email, whoops, that kind of got formatted funny there. We will set this one to 1 and 1. And instead of email errors, we'll call this one password errors. Copy that there, copy that there, save. Okay, let's just test this out. So we're going to submit. Sure enough, it says I need to have an email address. So that's working properly now. Let's paste one more time down here above our password. Whoops, guess I got to copy that one more time. And push that over a bit. So this one's going to be index 2, and this one will be, oops, I typed that one wrong, sorry. Name, oh, I typed the first one wrong. Let's see. This one is name, email, password. So we got to make sure these match up. So this one actually should be name errors. I typed that one wrong, so you can fix that one. Our first field is the name errors. Then we have email errors. So this one right here is email errors. And then the third field down here is actually the password errors. Okay, password errors. There we go. So now let's go ahead and check. So let's click register account. Sure enough, so I'm getting all 4 errors output there. So that looks great. Now, if I add a password, I'm only going to do 3 characters. The password required should disappear, but this one should still be present because we're still not above the 6 character limit. Let's click register. That works great. Now let's fill out the entire form. So I'll say Andrew at andrew.com, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So this should allow me to submit the form because I've passed all of my requirements. Hit register, and perfect. So our form submitted, we have no errors. Now we're ready to actually then process the data. Okay, so here comes the PDO step where we're going to be connecting to the database, and there's 2 steps we have to do here. We have to first check to see if the email address that was submitted already exists in our database, because if it does, we don't want to create a new one, okay? So if the email doesn't exist, then we can go ahead and hash the password, then insert the user row into the database. So that's going to be the logic of this step right here. Okay, and this is all happening inside of this, register button, meaning the form has been submitted. So let's okay, I think we can now submit the form. So we're going to make sure that there are no errors. So we're going to say if empty error message. So if there's no error messages at this point, we're going to then start doing the other logic. Okay, so we're going to write this logic inside of a try catch. So we're going to say try, and then we'll say catch. C-A-T-C-H. And then we want to catch our same thing as we did before. We're just going to be looking and catching the PDO exception. PDO exception. I can't ever spell that word. Exception. And with our error. And then we will just capture this as a PDO error, we'll call it. PDO error. And we'll set that equal to the get message. Okay, so for whatever reason our database call doesn't happen, we'll capture that inside of this local variable, and then we'll be able to display that on our page somewhere to let us know that something went wrong with our query. Okay, So we need to write our select statement. So we're going to say select, we'll just create a local variable here called select, stmt for statement. And this is going to be where we're going to write our SQL. So again, we're going to be using that DB. Remember, the DB variable is the variable that we created up inside of this connection. So that's in our connection right here, right? We have this variable called connection. That's our managing our connection. So it's already created for us. So we're just essentially now using it at this point. Okay, and the command we're going to be using here, or the method we need, is called prepare. So this is going to be called a prepared statement. So we're going to be preparing our SQL statement. And this is what's going to fix the problem of SQL injections. It'll remove that vulnerability from our system. Okay, so this is going to be SQL. So I'm going to say select name, and this is going to be your values over here, right? Whatever your field names are that you created inside of your database, we're going to be now selecting those field names. So let's grab those. So we're going to say select name, email. We're just going to select those two from now. And then this is going to say from users. This is the name of the table here, from the users table, where email equals, and then this is the important part here, you do a colon, and then you do the name of the prepared statement variable. I'm just using the same names to keep it simple, but this name here is going to correspond to our next line of code. Okay, so now we actually have to execute this statement here. So this is the statement that's being prepared. Now we have to write it in the execution. So we're going to say select statement. We're going to execute this now. So we're going to say execute. And we're going to pass into this execute function the variables that correspond to these prepared statements. So now we have to pass, it's an array here. So I'm just going to create an array. And it's going to be email is going to be the email variable. Okay, so we're assigning our email variable, which again, we think is a valid string, but we always want to make sure we're preparing it in these prepared statements. So email gets assigned to this email placeholder. The email placeholder is used up here in the actual database call. So this code is just checking to see if we already have a row in our database that belongs to the form that was submitted. So because we don't want to add duplicates, okay? And then we need to pull out the row. So we're going to say row equals select statement. And now we're going to say fetch. So this is going to actually fetch the row. And we're going to say, whoops, PDO. And then this is fetch associative array, like that. Fetch associate, like so. Okay, so that is the code. Whoops, I need a $sign right there. And now we can check to see if the row exists. Okay, so I'm gonna add in some database add in some fake data in the database so we can check this. But now we need to see if it's set. So we're gonna say if is set, whoops, let me open the parentheses here. So if is set, and we're going to be looking for the row of email, row sub email. Okay, so in other words, if the thing that was returned from the database query is the same as our email, okay, then we have a problem. Now you could do strict type checking like this, or you could just do double equals. It's up to you. But if what the user submitted, it already exists in the database, that's what this row is checking for, then we have to throw an error, okay? So we're gonna use that same error messages thing that we've been using all along. So we'll say error message, and this is for the email field, so it's index 1. So index 1, we need to say email already exists. So email address already exists. Please choose, so here we'd say, please choose another or log in instead, right? Something like that. Maybe they don't know they have an account, so we need to tell them they can just log in. Okay, so, whoops, I have an error here in my line. I need to put this closing parentheses on the is set. There we go. So if row is set equals email, that should fix that. Okay, perfect. Now let's go ahead and check this again. So if I fill in some data here, so I'm going to hit refresh. I'm just going to do Command R over here and resubmit the form. I'm not getting any errors because, of course, this email, andrew@andrew.com, doesn't exist. But let's go add it into the database to make sure this step is working. So let's come over to the database. I'm going to come in here to my content tab, and I'm going to manually add a row. Okay, so I'm just going to come in here and say name, Andrew, email. Let me drag these out so you can see them. Is Andrew. Password, we'll just drop something. Oh, this is going to make me do 60 characters. Shoot. We're going to cheat here for a second. This is going to... I don't want to try to get exactly 60 characters here, so I'm going to discard this. We'll come back really quick and just make this allow nullable here for the password. And for that one, just make those so they can be optional there. And then let's go ahead and add this row in right here. And I'll just put andrew@andrew.com here. So I do have a user in the database. Now let's go back to our code here, and we're going to make sure that our error messages are showing up properly. Okay, so let's go ahead and resend this form. So I'll resubmit this. And you can see, sure enough, we're getting that proper error now. Email address already exists. Please choose another. So I know that this try statement is actually working here. And we're getting that error message based on the results there. So now that we know that that is working here with this error message, let's go ahead now and write the rest of the logic that's going to happen, assuming the email doesn't exist and we need to create the row in the database. So we'll just kind of keep coming down here. We'll do this right after this initial if. We're going to do then else right here. So we'll say else. So if it exists, we give an error message. Otherwise, if it doesn't exist, let's write the rest of the logic. So here, the first thing we're going to do is hash the password that we receive from the form. Now remember, passwords or any data that's submitted on a form is submitted in plain text. So we have to capture that and hash it and then insert it into the database. So let's go ahead and we're going to use this function here in PHP. It's called password hash. And this will automatically hash the password with the latest algorithms that are constantly being updated. So it's a nice, easy function to use. And we're just going to be able to take the password field that we have up here. So we already have a variable for that. So we're just going to pass in the password there. And then you can pass in the sort of type you want here. But we're going to do one called password default here, which is just the default hash, which is maybe bcrypt or something. I don't actually know. Then we're going to do an extra value here. Now, in our form, we're not actually capturing the date the user submits the form, but I want to know the registration date. So we're actually going to create that date on the fly with PHP and then insert that into the database. So I'm just going to create a new variable here called created. And I'm going to set that equal to the current date. So I'm going to do a new date time. And if we don't pass any parameters to this new date time function here, it's just going to give us the exact current time and assign it to that created. Now the next thing I need to do is format this variable or this timestamp into the format that your database requires. Now this depends on what kind of database you're using, but I am using the MySQL database, and it has a very specific format for the date time field type. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say, we'll just say created equals, and then we're going to do a created, and we're going to format this into a specific format. So it's going to be y-m-d, that's an uppercase Y, space, capital H, uppercase H, colon I, colon S, like that. So it's going to give us our year, our month, our day, and then hour, minutes, and seconds. So this specific format is for the MySQL date time type field. But again, depending on your database or however you want to format that is up to you. Okay, so now we have that created variable that will give us the current timestamp. And now we can actually write the insert statement to insert this data into the database. So we'll just create a new variable here called insert statement, similarly to our select statement up here. we're going to prepare an SQL query. So we're going to say DB, and we're going to say prepare, and then we're going to insert in our MySQL string of SQL. So we're going to say insert into, and then the table name, which is in our case users, and then here's the parameters. So we're going to insert name, email, password, and created. Notice that I did not add the ID in this because remember, ID gets auto-incremented automatically, so I don't need to even pass it in. The database itself will handle that. And then we're going to say values, and we have 4 parameters in the insert into, so we have to also have 4 values over here. So the values again are going to be our name parameters. So this one's going to be a name, and then an email, and then a password, and then the created, like so. Okay, so there's our statement. And now let's go ahead and bind those parameters. So we can go ahead and wrap this inside of an if statement. So we're going to kind of write it. It's going to look a little bit funny, but I'm going to write it like this. If, and then I'm going to say our insert, just like we did before, statement. We're going to execute the query, execute, and then we're going to pass in all of the bound parameters. So the name, whoops, I got to put this in quotes. The name, it corresponds to our name variable. And the email, whoops, colon, email corresponds to the email variable, etc., etc. The password corresponds to our new hashed password. So we have to make sure we pass in the hashed password, not the regular password. That would defeat the entire purpose of hashing. And then lastly, the created. We're going to pass in our timestamp for our created variable. Okay, so there's those 4 right there. So next we'll go ahead and say if this was successful. So if the statement executes, it's going to return true. If the statement doesn't execute, it would return false. But we'll just say if it is true, then let's go ahead and redirect the user to the a page that they're supposed to be on. So I'm just going to do a simple thing here. I'm going to say header, and then we'll say location. We're going to send them to the index .php page, and this is kind of just a simple trick here, but this isn't really necessary. But I'm going to pass a message. I'm going to have the message be set up to URL encode some sort of message. So I can say URL encode, and whoops, I'm going to need to add a period there. And then, now this is completely optional, but what I'm thinking here is that if the user registers on my site, I don't want to accept any arbitrary email. So I would typically want to email them a confirmation email and say, click here to confirm that, this is an active email address. And so until the user does that confirmation step, I don't want to grant them access. So I could send them over to something that just, says, click the verification email or something like this, right? I'm not going to finish all this out, but you get the idea. So I'm not going to actually implement the logic behind that. You'd have to write some code that sends off an email and stores that email, stores like a token in your database. So when the user clicks that link in their email, you can look up that token and then verify it's a real email. There's a lot of different ways you could do that, but again, this is completely up to you, but just for simplicity's sake, I'll just simply redirect them to the index page. If you're okay having them sign up and whatever the information they provide is good, just redirect them to the, your private welcome page or whatever you want to do there. All right. So that should be pretty much it for this page. We're almost there. We just have now the logic to do on the login page. Now let's test our form out. So I'm going to come over here and let's just reset everything. Oops, looks like I have an error, line 53. Oh, I'm missing a semicolon right there. So let's save that and refresh. There we go. Okay, let's test our format. This should register a user now. So I'm going to say my name is Follow Andrew. We'll just put that in there. Follow Andrew, and we'll say hello at followandrew.dev. And the password we'll just do 123456. and I'm going to hit register an account. And it looks like it worked. So let's go check the database to see if that user is there. So I'm going to head back over here to my database and refresh. Perfect. Now you can see, sure enough, I have a new user row, ID 2, so it auto-incremented, and notice the password in the database is hashed, so I'm not able, to read it, even if I wanted to. And then we have the created that has the exact current timestamp when this user signed up. So everything is working great. Let's now go ahead and write the login logic so that I can actually log in with this new account. So back here to VS Code, and this time we're going to switch over. Now that I've got all this in, I'm going to come up here and actually delete the pre-tags. That was just for our testing. So I'll just delete those out. We don't need those anymore. And let's move over here to the register page. So, or sorry, not the register page, our index page is what we want. We want to do the logic so we can log in. Okay, so let me just double check my notes, make sure I'm not missing anything here. Yeah, I think we're okay. Okay, so let's jump over here. I think we're actually already on that page. So yep, we're on index page here. So that's great. Now notice that my redirect worked. Notice I did that as a get variable. There's my message. It says click the email verification email, but that's not actually displayed anywhere here to the user. So what I could do is I could just check for the presence of that request variable, some down here in my container, and then display that message. So let's just hurry and kind of do that really quick. So we'll come down here and we'll just write a little bit of a code, and we'll say if is set. We're going to check for the presence of, the request sub MSG. That's the message, right? That's the name of the get variable we use. So if that thing is present, then we'll just echo out an alert. So we'll just do a paragraph tag here, and we'll close the paragraph. And then we will just concatenate this string really quickly and just echo out this request to make sure it's going to work for us okay. So let's save that. And whoops, looks like I'm missing a parenthesis right there. We'll space those out so it's easier to read. Now let's go ahead and refresh. And sure enough, you can see there's the message. Now just to make this message a little bit more obvious, I'll put a little bit of classes in here that come from Bootstrap. So I'll call this thing an alert, and I'll say alert-warning because it's going to be a warning alert. And now if we refresh this page, oh, whoops, not alert equals, this is supposed to be class equals. There we go. Now I should see some styling on this. There we go. So I get this nice little alert that tells them they have to do something, right? Okay, so now let's come up here and let's write the code to make the actual login work. So we already have our connection.php, so we're already connected to the database there. Now we're going to be working with sessions, so I do need to do the session start, which again allows me to then populate my session if the user's credentials are correct. Okay, so the first thing we want to write here is if we already have a session with an active user, we just want to redirect them to the welcome page. So we'll write that logic. We're going to say if is set, and we're going to check that session variable, and we're going to check for the user key. So if the user key is present, then I keep forgetting a bracket there, or a parentheses. If the user is present, that means I already have an active user, so we're just going to redirect them to the let's see, welcome.php is what we're considering to be our private page. So we'll just redirect them right over. So let's just save and refresh. Perfect. So I'm not being redirected because I don't have an active user session. Okay. Now it's very similar to what we did with the code when we created the register page. We need to check to see if this form has been submitted. If the user did submit the form, then we need to make a call to the database, check the credentials against the username and password in the database. If they match, then we create a session, store our user in the session variable, and redirect them to the welcome page. So we're going to say if, whoops, not ID, if is set, and we're going to be looking for the request. And in this case, it's going to be the login button. Okay, so the login button is the name of this login button right here. So if we come down and look at our HTML, right there it is right there. That has the name of login button. So if that is present in the request variable, that means the form has been submitted. Okay, so now let's do the same thing before. We're just going to take the email. In fact, I can probably copy some of this. So I'm going to come over here to the register page and I'm going to grab I'll just grab these three right here. And whoops, jump over here and paste. Now we don't have a name, so I can delete that one. So we'll take the email and we'll filter that. We'll take the password and we'll filter that like we did before. Same type of thing there. And then let's check to make sure we have those form fields so that we can pass in the error messages as well. So we'll say if empty email. So if the email is empty, we need to throw an error, right? So here's where we're going to get our error message. And I'm not going to I'm not going to do indexes, meaning the email is index 1 and the password is index 2 like I did before, because basically if the credentials are wrong, the credentials are wrong. So I'm just going to display a message that says credentials are wrong. So I'll just have a simple error message in this one. And I'll set this equal to a string here that just says must enter email, just to check to make sure it's not empty. Whoops, that's spelled incorrectly. That should be email. And then we'll just do another else if. So I'm just going to chain these in a big else. And then we'll just copy this and paste it down here. And then inside of this else if, we're going to check to see if the password is present. So similar type of thing up here. We'll just say if empty password. And it's going to say must enter password. So this is just making sure that they enter both of those correctly. So now let's come down here and write the logic to display those errors if they exist, just like we did before. So above the email field, we can just, actually I'll just place these right below here. It probably really doesn't matter where I add this. I'm going to kind of steal this code right here and paste it down below here. So we'll say if we have an error message, so if is set the error message, display some errors. So we'll just do actually since I'm chaining those, yeah, we don't need to, we don't have to do a for loop because there's only ever going to be one error message. So we'll do something like that. Okay, let's see if this works now. So let's refresh and let's try to log in. Oh, I do have an array. So I need to, we can, well, I guess we are going to have to loop on that because our error message is an array. Even though there's only one item in the array, that's kind of funny. We're making it an array even though there's only one item. But that's okay. We'll just do a loop, a little simple loop down here. Okay, so same as we did before, we're going to say for each error message as, we'll just call this, I don't know, login error or something like that. And then we'll place this echo inside of the for each loop and then replace that like that. Okay, so this should work. Let's see if this actually works. Perfect. So it says must enter an email. Now on this one, I actually want the warning to be red. So I'm going to switch this to the danger class, which is a red class in Bootstrap, and now it's red. So must enter email. Good. So if we enter an email, blah@blah.com, and try to submit, must enter password. Good. So the password's now invalid too. Perfect. Now I should also mention that Bootstrap has a ton of built-in classes for dealing with form styles. So you can actually make the field itself be highlighted red with a red arrow and red text on this and red outline and all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to go into that much detail, but it is possible. All right, so now we have our error messages popping up. That looks fine. We'll come up here and continue writing our logic now. So assuming we make it down to this point in our code, that means we do have a email and password. So now we need to write the logic to test the database or submit to the database. Okay, so we'll just do this inside of an else. So if we have errors, then we do this. Otherwise, here's where we're going to check our database. So we're going to do another select statement. If I can type this. So select statement, this is very similar to what we already did. So we're just going to grab our database variable and we're going to write another prepared statement. Here's our SQL. So we're going to say select star. So I want to select everything from the user row. Select star from users where email equals email. And then I'm going to say limit 1. And the reason why I'm writing limit 1 is because I'm not allowing duplicate accounts. So I don't need to check for many accounts. If one row is found, that's all that will ever be returned. So I can just limit this query to having one result. Okay, so now let's go ahead and just as we did before, our select statement, we are going to execute it. And we're going to execute this on array. We need to pass in our bound parameters here. So we simply, in this one, we just have our email because we only have one thing. So the email is going to correspond to the email. One thing that I would probably do that I haven't implemented this that I think is a very good idea for you is whenever I would probably implement this on my register page. In fact, I'll just do it right now because I think it's well worthwhile. Whenever you're accepting an email address from a user, always make them lowercase. You'll have all sorts of crazy things submitted from user with uppercase letters mixed with lowercase letters, and email addresses are case insensitive. So what I would do is I would do a string str to lower on this email address. So I would lowercase the email address right away, then filter it and make sure it's a regular email. This ensures that all of the emails that are being entered into your database are always going to be in lowercase format. That way, when you're back here on your checking page, you want to do the same thing. So we need to come over here and say string to lower, and we need to lowercase this. Otherwise, you could have an email with a capital H. When you query the database, it's going to say no record found because you have casing issues. So always lowercase those so that you get a match. Hope that makes sense. Okay, let's see. We need to now pull these out. So notice we're only looking up in the database for an email match. If there's an email match, we bring all the data in, and then we check to make sure the password matches the submitted password as well. So now we can write that logic. It says if, and this command here is called, actually we need to, getting ahead of myself, we need to pull out the row. So the row is going to equal the select statement, and just like we did before, we need to fetch the row, and it's going to be a PDO, just as we did before, fetch associative, and that looks fine. I always end up doing one of those instead of two. There we go. So this pulls out the row from the database, and then we can do some checks to make sure we actually have a row. So we can say if, and we're going to do another select statement. So if the select statement, this is a function here of PDO, but there's a function in here called row count. If the statement row count is greater than 0, meaning yes, there was an actual row returned, then we can check the password. Okay. If the row count is not greater than 0, that means that user didn't exist in the database. So then we can redirect them. So I'll write that next. We'll say else. I'll write this if statement in a minute. So here we need to just add an error message. So we'll create an error message, and we'll just set this to say wrong email or password. Now, I have seen a lot of systems that will tell you email not found. And that's a problem. You want to make this fairly vague because you don't want to allow your system to allow other people to check to see if email accounts exist. For example, you could have a competitor come to your login and just start entering email addresses, and then all of a sudden one makes a match, and they would know that that email already exists in your system, and you don't want to give away that information. So you want to make this fairly vague. the error message. So they don't know if the email or password was invalid. That way they can't tell if you have existing accounts. Let's see. That should do it for that. Let's now come inside of our if. Let's just make sure we don't have any PHP errors here so far. Okay. So let's write the logic to check to make sure now the password is valid. So here we're going to write another if statement. So we're going to say if password, this function is called password verify. And you just simply pass in the password. And we're going to match that against the password in the database, which is row sub password, right? Because that's where we pulled out the row from right there. Okay. So this is going to automatically check the password and do the algorithm, you know, the hashing check for you automatically. And then if this returns true, the password's matched. If it returns false, the passwords did not match. And so what we can do is we'll just simply start our session. So because we've already started our session, we can now populate this super global, the underscore session super global with data. So again, I'm going to be using the key user as my main key, and then everything below that will just be data I want to add to the session. So I want to add the name. So that's going to be set equal to row sub name. And then I'm just going to copy this and paste it down 3 times. So we're going to have the user name, we're going to have the user email, and we're going to have the user ID. Okay, so name, email, and you can put as much information as you want inside of the session or as little as you want. You definitely do not want to put the password in the session. So you don't want to put that, even though it is hashed, don't ever put the hashed password in the session. That can give you a security issue down the road because somebody could potentially hijack that session and then see the hashed password and then try to, you know, reverse the algorithm on that or something. But so not a good idea to spit that out. So I'm just going to add these 3, name, email, and ID, and store those in my session variable. And then they will be available to me in all future requests for this user. So I can check to make sure this session exists. I can check IDs, do all sorts of things that I need. Maybe I have user roles. I can check for role, things like that. Okay, if this password did not match, it's going to be the exact same thing. We're just going to return a message that says wrong email or password. So again, I don't want to tell them the password was wrong. I just want to say one of the 2 was wrong, so that's ambiguous. And then that should pretty much do it for our code on this guy. I think that's all we need. Now we could wrap all of this code right here inside of a try catch as well, just in case we have any PDO errors. So we can say try, and then I'll finish this up with a catch. And this is going to be just like we did before. So it's going to be the PDO exception. I thought I might be able to get it right once. EXCEPTION. Exception. And this is going to be our error there. And then we could output this, but I'll just say echo e get message. Something like that, right? So then I'll put all of this code right here inside of the try statement and the catch right there. Okay, so that again, that way if something was wrong, whoops, looks like I actually have an error. Unexpected, whoops, that's not supposed to be a $sign right there. So if for some reason I have an issue with my statement or something, my SQL, I'll get an error notifying me that I have some problems with my actual SQL string. This part right here, if you write invalid SQL, you'll get an error for that down here. Okay, so that, let's test it out now. Actually, I think we can actually log in with this. So let's refresh this page back to the default. Again, we're on the login page. So I'm going to use the hello at followandrew.dev. but I'm going to do an incorrect password. So I'm going to say 555555555. I'm going to see if that error message pops up. Let's go ahead and log in. Undefined variable, password, verify. So I know I have an error in my code. So, whoops, that's the issue. This is not a variable. This is a function call. Password verify should be a function. I accidentally typed the variable in there. Let's go ahead and save. And we will refresh and resend. Perfect. Okay, so I know I did the wrong password, and I did get the message that says wrong email or password. So now let's go back and refresh this, and now we'll do the correct one. So let's say hello@followandrew.dev. The password I used was 123456. Let's click the login button here. And I don't know what it did. I think it logged me in, but I haven't written the code to redirect me. So I left that line out. Got ahead of myself. I got so excited. So here we go. We have the session variables that we add, and now if everything is correct, right, the password verifies, we need to redirect the user to the private page. So here we're going to, I think I called that one the welcome page is what we're calling that one. So we'll just say header, and we're going to do the location to welcome.php. Okay, so this should work. Let's try it again. Refresh, resend. We made it. So here's the welcome page. Now notice there's nothing in the welcome page because it's empty. So let's come over here to the welcome page, and for simplicity's sake, we are just going to output the stuff that's in the session. So we can say, we'll open up our PHP tags, and we'll just maybe say echo, maybe we'll echo a header1 tag or something to make it fancy. So we'll close the header1 tag here. And we'll say welcome user, and then here I'll output the underscore session, and it's going to be sub user sub ID. Okay, let's just save that and see if that works. So we'll refresh, and undefined variable session. Oh, whoops, we have not included our session start at the top. So we need to come up here to our welcome page, and just like we did before, I thought we already did this, but apparently we did not. So we're going to require once our connection. Now I'm actually not going to be using the connection in this page, but typically you would, right? Once you redirect the user to a page, you'd want to query the database and pull out their photos or their orders or whatever you want there. All I'm going to be doing is just working with the session. So I need to do my session start, and that looks fine. So now we should be able to refresh here, and sure enough, because I added the session start, I can see I have a current session and the ID is 2. And then I'll just also do their name. Maybe instead of ID, I'll say name. Save and refresh. Welcome user, follow Andrew. And then just for simplicity's sake, I'll just print the entire session we have so we can see all the data that's available to us in the session. And of course, I can display any of this or do whatever I want with the data. So we have the user, right, which has name, email, and ID. And I can then output that. So at this point, right, here's where you could then write your own logic to start querying the database and pull out, user records that have the user ID of 2, when we know those are going to belong to user follow Andrew. And that's how you use the session inside of PHP. Now, the only thing we need to do on this page is if we don't have an active session, we need to redirect the user back to the login page. So we need to say if there isn't a session, so if not is set underscore session sub user. In other words, there is no user in the session. And the reason why I put all the user data in a key called user is because you may be storing other types of things in this session as well that don't necessarily belong to a user. So that's why I did it that way. And we'll just simply say header location index.php, which is our login page. Okay, so if we don't have an active logged in user, it's going to automatically redirect them to the login page. We will test that out in 1 second once we add our log out feature, which is our final thing we need to get going before we're done. So we need to have the ability for a user to log out. So on this page here, I'm going to write some code. Well, I'll just put a link here. This will just be easy. I'll say that href equals logout.php logout. There we go. And maybe I'll just turn this into a button. I'll say class equals button dash primary. Okay, let's save and refresh that. So I've got myself a logout button now. And when I click this logout button, it redirects me to the logout.php file. And then we're just going to write some code in that file that destroys the session. So let's come over here to the logout.php file, and we will finish this off. So this is fairly easy. We're going to only have just a couple lines here. So we're going to do the session start, because we always have to have that. And then we're going to do a command called session destroy. And that will destroy all of the session completely. And then we're just going to redirect these people back to the login page, index.php. Okay, and that's it. So that's all the code that's going to be in our logout page. So let's click back here. And so now if I click the logout button, it should destroy my session, redirect me back to the login page, and notice I'm logged out. So let's just manually try to go back to this welcome page to make sure that it's not allowing us to go there, because I shouldn't have an active session now. So I'm going to go to the welcome.php, hit return. Sure enough, I couldn't access it. It bounced me right back to the login page. So we know that that is all working correctly. Let's just go ahead and one more time log in here. So we'll just say hello at followandrew.dev, password 123456. Log ourselves in. Perfect. We get redirected to our page. And now I am authenticated. We've made it. So that's the full complete project of the session, user login, user logout, protected pages, database. Everything is there for you. Now, the last thing I'm going to follow up with is just a little bit of info on how this works behind the scenes, because once you have an active session, you may be wondering, well, how does the web browser know as I click between page and page and page that I'm still the same user? And the answer to that is within the actual request and header HTTP cycle with cookies. So I'm going to show you this. I think I'm in Firefox here. I don't know if you're in Firefox or Chrome, it should be fairly easy to see. So I'm going to pull this over, and I'm going to come up here and show you the actual network request. So I'm going to reload the page here because I still have an active session. And let's look at the requests we got. So notice we have a GET request on welcome.php. So what was sent here, if we look at the request and the response, notice the request header already had this thing called cookie, and it has my PHP session ID. That's what the session ID stands for, and there's this hashed string here. So every single request that I make to the web server has my session ID. That's how the web server is able to know, oh, this is session for Andrew, and every single session will have a unique ID. So once you log in, your web browser, or rather the web server, will store that cookie on your system with the session. And that cookie then gets sent with every subsequent request until you log out, of course, or until you close the browser window. So if I were to close the browser window and come back up, this cookie would be destroyed and I would no longer have a session, so I'd have to re-log in to reset the cookie. But once you're logged in, every single page I visit, even if I go back to index.php, my session is still active here on the, oops, this is redirecting me to welcome. Maybe login. Does login redirect me? I think they all do. I can't remember how we set that up. Oh no, login is index.php. Yeah, they are. So anyway, you get the idea, right? That every single page will have that session ID. And that's what the web server checks to see if it is alive. Anyway, I hope that made sense to you in some sort of way. I know this is a really long tutorial, but I wanted to go through it fairly slowly and explain the little bits and pieces as we moved along. So for those just starting out, can hopefully start to understand and grasp some of these slightly more complicated topics when you're dealing with cookies and sessions and things like that. So We could really spend another several hours diving deep into this. The method that we used for our login form is all procedural code. We could easily refactor all of this code and make it more object-oriented, set up a MVC, like a model view controller, and do it in that sort of method as well. There's lots of different takes and ways, things you can do this. But give us a thumbs up, share the content, like, subscribe, all of those goodies, and post any questions you have down here in the comment section so you can help others out as well. We will see you in the next one.